The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the apartment, casting a pale glow on Layla as she stood at the kitchen counter, absently stirring a cup of tea. The clatter of Noor's cereal bowl broke the silence, but her 10-year-old daughter's chatter barely registered. Layla nodded along, offering distracted smiles, her mind already anticipating another long, quiet evening. Rami's side of the bed had been cold by the time she woke up, and his usual note, a curt apology for leaving early, was conspicuously absent today. By the time she dropped Noor off at school and headed to her own classroom, the familiar rhythm of her day had set in. Teaching distracted her just enough to make the hours pass quickly, but a dull ache always lingered. Layla loved her students, but she couldn't help envying the unburdened freedom of their youth. They still believed in limitless possibilities, while her own dreams of becoming an artist had long been folded away like old, yellowing paper. That evening, Rami texted, his message a single sentence, "Working late, don't wait up." She set the phone down on the counter, staring at the words as if they carried weight she couldn't lift. Dinner was already simmering on the stove, its aroma filling the small apartment, but she had no appetite. She thought about calling a friend, or even just sitting with Noor to watch a silly movie. Instead, she settled for silence, the clink of her spoon against the saucepan the only sound in the room. It was later that night, just as she was stacking plates in the cupboard, that the door opened and a voice, warm and unfamiliar, broke the monotony. "Layla, there you are." She turned to see Sammy standing in the doorway, a battered guitar case slung over his shoulder and a duffel bag in his hand. Rami's younger brother had the kind of energy that filled a room effortlessly, and Layla felt a small smile tug at her lips despite herself. Sammy grinned as he stepped inside, setting down his belongings with an exaggerated sigh of relief. "Traffic was terrible, but I made it," he announced, his voice carrying a lightness that seemed to make the walls breathe. Noor rushed to greet him, wrapping her arms around his waist, and he knelt down to her level, asking about school and friends with genuine interest. Layla watched the scene unfold, her smile fading as she remembered Rami's curt tone whenever he spoke to Noor, if he spoke to her at all. Rami had mentioned his brother's arrival only in passing. "He'll be here for a while," he'd said, his tone dismissive, as if it were an afterthought. Now, as Sammy unpacked and cracked jokes that made Noor giggle uncontrollably, Layla found herself drawn to his ease, his openness. The apartment felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. Later that night, as she lay in bed, Layla listened to the faint strumming of Sammy's guitar from the living room. The melody was gentle and unfamiliar, weaving through the stillness. For the first time in months, she didn't feel entirely alone. The days after Sammy's arrival brought a quiet shift to the household, one that Layla couldn't quite name, but felt deeply. Sammy was always there, tuning his guitar in the corner of the living room, teaching Noor to whistle a simple tune, or helping Layla with dinner while chatting about everything and nothing. He had a way of making the mundane feel lighter, as though his presence dissolved the invisible weight that had long pressed against her chest. One evening, as Layla washed dishes after dinner, Sammy leaned against the counter, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "You know," he said, his voice casual but curious, "Rami mentioned you used to paint. Do you still?" Layla paused, the question catching her off guard. She hadn't touched a brush in years. The last time she'd even thought about it was during a fleeting moment while packing Noor's art supplies for school. "No," she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. "Life got busy." Sammy frowned thoughtfully. "That's a shame," he said. "You don't seem like someone who'd give up on something they love so easily." The words stayed with her long after Sammy left the kitchen, lingering like an echo in the empty room. That night, as Noor slept and Sammy strummed softly in the living room, Layla found herself pulling an old, dusty box from the back of the wardrobe. Inside were forgotten brushes, dried-up tubes of paint, and a few unfinished canvases. She stared at them, her chest tightening with something she couldn't quite name, regret perhaps, or longing. The next day, while Sammy and Noor were out for a walk, she set up a small corner in the living room and began to paint. At first, her strokes were hesitant, the colors unfamiliar, but as the minutes turned into hours, she found herself immersed. The feel of the brush in her hand, the blending of hues on the canvas, it was as though she'd unlocked a part of herself that had been dormant for years. When Sammy returned, his eyes lit up at the sight of the painting. "Layla," he said, stepping closer, "this is incredible." She laughed, a little embarrassed. "It's nothing. Just something I used to do." "Don't downplay it," he said, his gaze fixed on the canvas. "You've got talent. Real talent." You shouldn't let that go. The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. For years, she'd felt invisible, her efforts unnoticed, her desires dismissed. Yet here was Sammy, seeing her in a way Rami hadn't in a long time. That night, as she cleaned her brushes, she caught herself smiling, a quiet, private smile. Painting had awakened something in her, and for the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of hope. But mixed with that hope was a flicker of something else, something more dangerous. She pushed the thought aside, yet it lingered, just beneath the surface. The tension between Layla and Sammy grew like an unspoken melody, weaving itself into the fabric of their daily lives. It wasn't just in the stolen glances or the moments of silence that stretched a little too long. It was in the way Sammy's laughter felt warmer when Layla was near, or how her heart skipped when his hand brushed hers, even accidentally. Neither spoke of it, yet it hovered between them, undeniable and intoxicating. One rainy afternoon, while Noor was at a friend's house and Rami buried in another late night at work, Layla found herself alone with Sammy. He was perched on the balcony, his guitar resting on his lap as he played a soft, haunting tune. The sound drew her in like a magnet, and before she realized it, she was standing by the door, watching him. Sammy glanced up, his fingers pausing on the strings. "Come sit," he said, patting the space beside him. She hesitated for a moment, her pulse quickening, but then stepped out into the cool air. The rain drummed softly against the railing as she sat down. "What's that song?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's something I've been working on," Sammy said, strumming a few more notes. "It's not finished yet." Layla closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. It was raw and beautiful, filled with a yearning that mirrored her own emotions. "It's breathtaking," she said, opening her eyes to meet his. Sammy smiled, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his expression, something vulnerable and unguarded. "You inspire me, you know," he said softly. The words hung in the air, charged and dangerous. Layla's breath hitched, her mind racing. She knew this was the moment to step back, to laugh it off or change the subject. But instead, she found herself saying, "I don't know what you mean." Sammy set his guitar aside and turned to face her fully. "I think you do," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "You're more alive than you realize, Layla. And it's not just your paintings. It's you." Her heart pounded as the rain blurred the cityscape beyond them. She wanted to deny it, to dismiss his words as foolish or fleeting. But she couldn't. Instead, she looked down at her hands, trembling in her lap. "This isn't right," she whispered, though the conviction in her voice wavered. Sammy leaned closer, his gaze searching hers. "Maybe not," he said, his voice low, "but it feels real." The space between them disappeared, an almost magnetic pull drawing them closer. Then, as if by some unspoken agreement, they stopped, their faces mere inches apart. Layla pulled away abruptly, standing up and clutching the railing. "I can't," she said, more to herself than him. Sammy didn't argue. He simply nodded, his expression filled with a mixture of understanding and regret. The moment passed, but the line had been crossed, leaving them both changed and unable to return to what once was. The discovery was unintentional, yet it hit like a thunderclap. Rami had come home earlier than usual, his briefcase in hand, his tie slightly loosened, a rare gesture of effort to spend more time with his family. Layla, startled by his unexpected arrival, had rushed to tidy up the living room, hoping the chaos of Noor's toys and her scattered art supplies would mask her nervous energy. But it was too late. Rami's eyes caught on the corner of her desk, where the edge of a canvas peeked out from under a hastily thrown scarf. "What's this?" he asked, his tone casual but with an undertone of curiosity. Layla froze, her breath caught in her throat. She moved toward him, intending to deflect, but he had already pulled the canvas free. The portrait stared back at him, vivid, intimate, and unmistakably Sammy. The brushstrokes captured every detail. The curve of his jawline, the light in his eyes, the faint shadow of his smile. Rami's expression darkened, his hand gripping the canvas so tightly it trembled. "It's nothing," Layla said quickly, her voice too high, too unconvincing. "Just a study. I was practicing." Rami turned to her, his eyes blazing with questions he wasn't ready to ask. "Practicing? This?" His voice cracked, hovering between disbelief and fury. Before she could respond, Sammy appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm as he took in the scene. "Rami, I can explain," he began, his tone placating. But Rami was already shaking his head, the betrayal sinking in. "Explain what?" he demanded, his voice rising. That you've been sneaking around in my own house? That you've made a fool of me? It's not what you think, Layla interrupted, stepping forward, desperate to contain the eruption. Nothing happened. Nothing. Rami spat, gesturing to the portrait. This doesn't look like nothing, Layla. This looks like something you've been pouring your heart into. Something you've hidden from me. The weight of his words landed heavily, and for the first time, Layla saw the cracks in Rami's stoic facade. His anger wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about the years of distance, the unspoken frustrations, the erosion of a bond that once held them together. Sammy stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. Rami, this is my fault. If you need to blame someone, blame me. Layla deserves better than this. The words, though well-meaning, only fueled the fire. Rami turned to Sammy, his fists clenched. You have no right to speak about what she deserves. You don't understand what it's like to build a life with someone, to sacrifice everything for a family. Layla's voice broke through the tension, soft but firm. And do you, Rami? Do you understand what it's like to feel invisible, to be forgotten while you're busy saving the world one contract at a time? Her words hung in the air, silencing both men. For the first time, Rami's anger wavered, replaced by something resembling recognition. But the damage had been done, the fragile threads of their lives unraveling before their eyes. As the rain outside intensified, the three of them stood in silence, each grappling with the realization that nothing would ever be the same.